Good afternoon, pretty shiny peoples. Um, Still on book 3. And like I said, these books are going to get longer as we go. But, well, I think, except one. I think one gets smaller in between. But we will finish book 3 today. And next time we will start book 4, which is called Wizards and Glass. And we've learned a lot about the characters he brought into his world, but in the next book, we're going to learn more about Roland himself. And so that'll be pretty interesting. Okay, so the last part of the Wastelands is called Riddles and Wastelands. All right, Roland said. Tell me his riddle. What about all the people out there? Eddie asked, pointing across the wide, pillared plaza of the cradle and towards the city beyond. What can we do for them? Nothing, Roland said. But it's still possible that we may be able to do something for ourselves. Now, what was the riddle? Eddie looked toward the streamlined shape of the mono. He said we'd have to prime the pump to get him going. Only his pump primes backward. Does it mean anything to you? Roland thought it over carefully, then shook his head. He looked down at Jake. Any ideas, Jake? Jake shook his head. I don't even see a pump. That's probably the easy part, Roland said. We say he and him instead of it and that because Blaine sounds like a living being, but he's still a machine. A sophisticated one, but a machine. He started his own engines, but it must take some sort of code or combination to open the gate in the train doors. We better hurry up, Jake said nervously. It's got to be 2 or 3 minutes since he last talked to us, at least. Don't count on it, Eddie said gloomily. Time's weird over here. Still, yeah. Eddie glanced toward Susanna, but she was sitting astride Roland's hip, looking at the numeric diamond with a daydreamy expression on her face. He looked back at Roland. I'm pretty sure you're right about it being a combination. That must be what all those number pads are for. He raised his voice. Is that it, Blaine? Have we got at least that much right? No response, only the quickening rumble of the mono's engines. Roland, Susanna said abruptly, you have to help me. The daydreamy look was being replaced by an expression of mingled horror, dismay, and determination. To Roland's eyes, she had never looked more beautiful or more alone. She had been on his shoulder when she stood at the edge of the clearing and watched the bear trying to claw Eddie out of the tree, and Roland had not seen her expression when he told her she must be the one to shoot it. But he knew what that expression had been, for he was seeing it now. Ka was a will, its one purpose to turn, and in the end it always came back to the place where it had started. So it had ever been, and so it was now. Susanna once again facing the bear, and her face said she knew it. What? He asked. What is it, Susanna? I know the answer, but I can't get it. It's stuck in my mind the way a fishbone can get stuck in your throat. I need you to help me remember. Not his face, but his voice. What he said. Jake glanced down at his wrist and was surprised all over again by a memory of the TikTok man's cat-like green eyes when he saw not his watch, but only the place where it had been, a white shape outlined by his deeply tanned skin. How much longer did they have? Surely no more than 7 minutes, and that was being generous. He looked up and saw that Roland had removed the cartridge from his gun belt and was walking it back and forth across the knuckles of his left hand. Jake felt his eyelids immediately grow heavy and looked away fast. What voice would you remember, Susanna Dean? Roland asked in a low, musing voice. His eyes were not fixed on her face, but on the cartridge as it did its endless limber dance across his knuckles, and back, across, and back. He didn't seem to look up to know that Jake had looked away from the dance of the cartridge, and Susanna had not. He began to speed it up until the cartridge almost seemed to be floating above the back of his hand. Help me remember the voice of my father, Susanna Dean said. For a moment there was silence, except for a distant crumbling explosion in the city, the rain pounding on the roof of the cradle and the fat throb of the monorail's slow trans engine. Then a low-pitched hydraulic hum cut through the air. Eddie looked away from the cartridge dancing across the gunslinger's fingers. It took an effort. He realized that in another few moments he would have been hypnotized himself, and peered through the iron bars. A slim silver rod was pushing itself up from the sloping pink surface between Blaine's forward windows. It looked like an antenna of some kind. Susanna? Roland asked in that same low voice. What? Her eyes were open, but her voice was distant and breathy, the voice of someone who's sleep-talking. Do you remember the voice of your father? Yes, but I can't hear it. 6 minutes, my friends. Eddie and Jake started and looked toward the control box speaker, but Susanna seemed not to have heard it all. She only stared at the floating cartridge. Below it, Roland's knuckles rippled up and down like the heddles of a loom. Try, Susanna, Roland urged, and suddenly he felt Susanna change within the circle of his right arm. She seemed to gain weight, and in some indefinable way, vitality as well. It was as if her essence had somehow changed, and it had. Why you want to bother with that bitch? The raspy voice of Detta Walker asked. Detta sounded both exasperated and amused. She never got no better than a C in math in her whole life. Wouldn't have got that without me to help her. She paused, then added grudgingly. And Daddy, he helped me some too. I knowed about them 4 special numbers, but was him showed us that. I got the biggest kick out of that, she chuckled. Reason Suze can't remember is 'cause Odetta never understood about them 4 special numbers in the first place. What 4 special numbers? Eddie asked. Prime numbers. She pronounced the word prime in a way that almost rhymed with calm. She looked at Roland, appearing to be wholly awake again now, except she was not Susanna, nor was she the same wretched, devilish creature who had previously gone under the name of Detta Walker, although she sounded the same. She went to Daddy crying and crying 'cause she was flunking that math course, and it was nothing but funny book algebra at that. She could do the work if I could. She could. But she didn't want to. Poetry reading bitch like her too good for a littler mathematica, you see. Detta threw her head back and laughed, but the poisoned, half-mad bitterness was gone from the sound. She seemed genuinely amused at the foolishness of her mental twin. And Daddy, he say I'm gonna show you a trick, Odetta. I learned it in college. It helped me get through the prime number business, and it gonna help you too. Help you find more's any prime number you want. Odetta, dumb as ever, she say, Teacher says ain't no formula for prime numbers, Daddy. And Daddy, he say right back, they ain't, but you can catch 'em, Odetta, if you have a net. He called it the net of Eratosthenes. Took me over to that box on the wall, Roland. I'm gonna answer that honky computer's riddle. I'm gonna throw you a net and catch you a train riddle. Roland took her over, closely followed by Eddie, Jake, and Oy. Give me that piece of charcoal you keep, you poke. He rummaged and brought out a short stub of blackened stick. Detta took it and peered at the diamond shape of grid numbers. Ain't exactly the way Daddy showed me, but I reckon it comes to the same, she said after a moment. Prime number be like me. Ornery and 4 special. Gotta be a number don't never divide, even septin by 1 its own self. 2 is prime, 'cause you can divide it by and 2, but it's the only even number that's prime. You can take all the rest as even. I'm lost, Eddie said. That's 'cause you stupid, white boy, Detta said, but not unkindly. She looked closely at the diamond shape a moment longer, then quickly began to touch the tip of the charcoal to all the even-numbered pads, leaving small black smudges on them. 3's prime, but no product you get by multiplying 3 can be prime, she said. And now Roland heard an odd but wonderful thing. Detta was fading out of the woman's voice. She was being replaced not by Odetta Holmes, but by Susanna Dean. He would not have to bring her out of this trance. She was coming out of it on her own quite naturally. Susanna began using her charcoal to touch the multiples of threes which were left, now that even numbers had been eliminated. 9, 15, 21, and so on. Same with 5 and 7, she murmured, and suddenly she was awake and all Susanna Dean again. You just have to mark the odd ones, like 25 that haven't been crossed out already. The diamond shape on the control box now looked like this. Oh, hold on, guys. Can you see it? No, hold on. I gotta keep moving it around till it catches. Somewhere, maybe. Dang it. I can't. I'm trying really hard to show it to you. Hold on. Oh, you can kind of see it right there. There we go. There it is. That is what the diamond looks like now. All right. Okay. Hold on one sec. My dog's getting into something. Okay, he needed something to chew on. Sorry about that. Did you guys see the diamonds? I don't know. Yep, right there. There's the diamond. Okay. All right, where were we? There, she said tiredly. What's left in the net are the prime numbers between 1 and 100. I'm pretty sure that's the combination that opens the gate. You have 1 minute, my friends. You are proving to be a good deal thicker than I had hoped you would be. Eddie ignored Blaine's voice and threw his arms around Susanna. Are you back, Suze? Are you awake? Yes, I woke up in the middle of what she was saying, but I let her talk a little longer anyway. Seemed impolite to interrupt. She looked at Roland. What do you say? Want to go for it? 50 seconds. Yes, you try the combination, Susanna. It's your answer. She reached out toward the top of the diamond, but Jake put his hand over hers. No, he said. This pump primes backward, remember? She looked startled and smiled. That's right. Clever Blaine and clever Jake, too. They watched in silence as she pushed each number in turn, starting with 97. There was a minute click as each pad locked. There was a minute click as each pad locked down. There was no tension-filled pause after she touched the last button. The gate in the corner of the barrier immediately began to slide up its tracks, rattling harshly and showering down flakes of rust from somewhere high above as it went. Not bad at all, Blaine said admiringly. I'm looking forward to this very much. May I suggest you climb on board quickly? In fact, you may wish to run. There are several gas outlets in this area. Three human beings, one carrying a fourth on his hip, and one small furry animal ran through the opening in the barrier and sprinted toward Blaine the Mono. It stood humming in its narrow loading bay, half above the platform and half below it, looking like a giant cartridge, one which had been painted in an incongruous shade of pink. Lying in the open breech of a high-powered rifle in the vastness of the cradle, Roland and the others looked like mere moving specks. Above them, flocks of pigeons, now with only 40 seconds to live, swooped and swirled beneath the cradle's ancient roof. As the travelers approached the Mono, a curved section of its pink hull slid up, revealing a doorway. Beyond it was thick, pale blue carpeting. Welcome to Blaine, a soothing voice said as they pelted aboard. They all recognized that voice. It was a slightly louder, slightly more confident version of Little Blaine. Praise the Imperium. Make sure your transit card is available for collection, and remember that false boarding is a serious crime punishable by law. We hope you enjoy your trip. Welcome to Blaine. Praise the Imperium. Please make sure your transit card. The voice suddenly sped up, first becoming the chatter of a human chipmunk and then high-pitched garbly whine. There was a brief electronic curse, boop, and then it cut out entirely. I think we can dispense with that boring old shit, don't you? Blaine asked. From outside came a tremendous thudding explosion. Eddie, who was now carrying Susanna, was thrown forward and would have fallen if Roland hadn't caught him by the arm. Until that moment, Eddie had held on to the desperate notion that Blaine's threat about the poison gas was no more than a sick joke. You should have known better, he thought. Anyone who thinks impressions of old movie actors is funny absolutely cannot be trusted. I think it's like a law of nature. Behind them, the curved section of the hole slid back into place with a soft thud. Air began to hiss gently from hidden vents, and Jake felt his ears pop gently. I think he just pressurized the cabin. Eddie nodded, looking around with wide eyes. I felt it too. Look at this place. Wow. He had once read of an aviation company, Regent Air, it might have been, that had catered to people who wanted to fly between New York and Los Angeles in grander style than airplanes such as Delta and United allowed for. They had operated a customized 727 complete with drawing room, bar, video lounge, and sleeper compartments. He imagined that the interior of that plane must have looked a little like what he was seeing now. They were standing in a long tubular room, furnished with plush upholstered swivel chairs and modular sofas. At the far end of the compartment, which had to be at least 80 feet long, was an area that looked not like a bar, but a cozy bistro. An instrument that could have been a harpsichord stood on the pedestal of polished wood highlighted by hidden baby spotlight. Eddie almost expected Hoagie Carmichael to appear and start tinkling out stardust. Indirect lighting glowed from panels placed high along the walls and dependent from the ceiling halfway down, and the compartment was a chandelier. To Jake, it looked like a smaller replica of the one which had lain in ruins on the ballroom floor of the mansion. Nor did this surprise him. He had begun to take such connections and doublings as a matter of course. The only thing about this splendid room which seemed wrong was its lack of even a single window. The piece de resistance stood on a pedestal below the chandelier. It was an ice sculpture of a gunslinger with a revolver in his left hand. The right hand was holding the bridle of the ice horse that walked, head down and tired, behind him. Eddie could see there were only 3 digits on his hand, the last 2 fingers and the thumb. Jake, Eddie, and Susanna stared in fascination at the haggard face beneath the frozen hat as the floor began to thrum gently beneath their feet. The resemblance to Roland was remarkable. I had to work rather fast, I'm afraid, Blaine said modestly. Does it do anything for you? It's absolutely amazing, Susanna said. Thank you, Susanna of New York. Eddie was testing one of the sofas with his hand. It was incredibly soft. Touching it made him want to sleep for at least 16 hours. The great old ones really traveled in style, didn't they? Blaine laughed again, and the shrill, not quite sane undertone of that laugh made them look at each other uneasily. Don't get the wrong idea, Blaine said. This was the Barony cabin, what I believe you would call first class. Where are the other cars? Blaine ignored the question. Beneath their feet, the throb of the engines continued to speed up. Susanna was reminded of how the pilots revved their engines before charging down the runway at LaGuardia or Idlewild. Please take your seats, my interesting new friends. Jake dropped into one of the swivel chairs. Oy jumped promptly into his lap. Roland took the chair nearest him, sparing one glance at the ice sculpture. The barrel of the revolver was beginning to drip slowly into the shallow china basin in which the sculpture stood. Eddie sat down on one of the sofas with Susanna. He was every bit as comfortable as his hand had told him it would be. Exactly where are we going, Blaine? Blaine replied in the patient voice of someone who realizes he is speaking to a mental inferior and must make allowances. Along the path of the beam, at least, as far along it as my track goes. To the Dark Tower? Roland asked. Susanna realized it was the first time the gunslinger had actually spoken to the loquacious ghost in the machine below Lud. Only as far as Topeka, Jake said in a low voice. Yes, Blaine said. Topeka is the name of my termination point, although I am surprised you know it. With all you know about our world, Jake thought, how come you don't know that some lady wrote a book about you, Blaine? Was it the name change? Was something that simple enough to fool a complicated machine like you into overlooking your own biography? And what about Beryl Evans, the woman who supposedly wrote Charlie the Choo Choo? Did you know her, Blaine? And where is she now? Good question. But Jake somehow didn't think this would be a good time to ask them. The throb of the engine became steadily stronger. A faint thud, not nearly as strong as the explosion which had shaken the cradle as they boarded, ran through the floor. An expression of alarm crossed Susanna's face. Oh shit, Eddie. My wheelchair, it's back there. Eddie put an arm around her shoulders. Too late now, babe, he said as Blaine the Mono began to move, sliding toward its slot in the cradle for the first time in 10 years, and for the last time in its long, long history. The Barony cabin was a particularly fine visual mode, Blaine said. Would you like me to activate it? Jake glanced at Roland, who shrugged and nodded. Yes, please, Jake said. What happened then was so spectacular that it stunned all of them into silence. Although Roland, who knew little of technology, but who had spent his entire life on comfortable terms with magic, was the least wonderstruck of the four. It was not a matter of windows appearing in the apartment's curved walls. The entire cabin, floor and ceiling as well as walls, grew milky, grew translucent, grew transparent, and then disappeared completely. Within a space of 5 seconds, Blaine the Mono seemed to be gone, and the pilgrims seemed to be zooming through the lane of the city with no aid or support at all. Susanna and Eddie clutched each other like small children in the path of a charging animal. Oi barked and tried to jump down the front of Jake's shirt. Jake barely noticed. He was clutching the sides of his seat and looking from side to side, his eyes wide with amazement. His initial alarm was being replaced by amazed delight. The furniture groupings were still here, he saw. So was the bar and the piano harpsichord and the ice sculpture Blaine had created as a party favor. But now this living room configuration appeared to be cruising 70 feet above Ludd's rain-soaked central district. 5 feet to Jake's left, Eddie and Susanna were floating along on one of the couches. 3 feet to his right, Roland was sitting in a powder blue swivel chair, his dusty, battered boots resting on nothing, flying serenely over the rubble-strewn urban wasteland below. Jake could feel the carpet beneath his moccasins, but his eyes insisted that neither the carpet nor the floor beneath it was still there. He looked back over his shoulder and saw the dark slot in the stone flank of the cradle slowly receding in the distance. Eddie! Susanna! Check it out! Jake got to his feet, holding Oi inside his shirt, and began to walk slowly through what looked like empty space, taking the initial step required at a great deal of willpower. Because his eyes told him there was nothing at all between the floating island of furniture, but once he began to move, the undeniable feel of the floor beneath him made it easier. To Eddie and Susanna, the boy appeared to be walking on thin air, while the battered, dingy buildings of the city slid by on either side. Don't do that, kid, Eddie said feebly. You're going to make me sick up. Jake lifted Oi carefully out of his shirt. It's okay, he said, and set him down. See? Oi, the bumbler agreed. But after one look between his paws at the city park currently unrolling beneath them, he attempted to crawl onto Jake's feet and sit on his moccasins. Jake looked forward and saw the broad gray stroke of the monorail track ahead of them, rising slowly but steadily through the buildings and disappearing into the rain. He looked down again and saw nothing but the street and floating membranes of low cloud. How come I can't see the track underneath us, Blaine? The images you see are computer-generated, Blaine replied. The computer erases the track from the lower quadrant image in order to present a more pleasing view, and also to reinforce the illusion that the passengers are flying. It's incredible, Susanna murmured. Her initial fear had passed, and she was looking around eagerly. It's like being on a flying carpet. I keep expecting the wind to blow back my hair. I can provide that sensation if you like, Blaine said. Also, a little moisture, which will match current outside conditions. It might necessitate a change of clothes, however. That's all right, Blaine. There's such a thing as taking an illusion too far. The track slipped through a tall cluster of buildings, which reminded Jake a little of the Wall Street area in New York. When they cleared these, the track dipped to pass under what looked like an elevator road. That was when they saw the purple cloud and the crowd of people fleeing before it. Blaine, what's that? Jake asked. But he already knew. Blaine laughed, but made no other reply. The purple vapor drifted from the gratings in the sidewalk and the smashed windows of the deserted buildings, but most of it seemed to be coming from manholes like the one Gasher had used to get into the tunnels below the streets. Their iron covers had been blown clear by the explosion they had felt as they were boarding the mono. They watched in silent horror as the bruise-colored gas crept down the avenues and spread into the debris-littered side streets. It drove those inhabitants of Lud, still interested in survival, before it like cattle. Most were pubes, judging from their scarves, but Jake could see a few splashes of bright yellow as well. Old animosities had been forgotten now that the end was finally upon them. The purple cloud began to catch up with the stragglers, mostly old people who were unable to run. They fell down, clawing at their throats and screaming soundlessly the instant the gas touched them. Jake saw an agonized face staring up at him in disbelief as they passed over, saw the eye sockets suddenly fill up with blood, and closed his eyes. Ahead, the monorail track disappeared into the oncoming purple fog. Eddie winced and held his breath as they plunged in, but of course it parted around them, and no whiff of the death engulfing the city came to them. Looking into the streets below was like looking through a stained glass window into hell. Susanna put her face against his chest. Make the walls come back, Blaine, Eddie said. We don't want to see that. Blaine made no reply, and the transparency around and below them remained. The cloud was already disintegrating into ragged purple streamers. Beyond it, the buildings of the city grew smaller and closer together. The streets of this section were tangled alleyways, seemingly without order or coherence. In some places, whole blocks appeared to have been burned flat and a long time ago, for the planes were reclaiming these areas, burying the rubble and grasses which would someday swallow all of Lud, the way the jungle swallowed the great civilizations of the Incas and Mayas, Eddie thought. The wheel of Ka turns and the world moves on. Beyond the slums, that Eddie felt sure was what they had been even before the evil days came, was a gleaming wall. Blaine was moving slowly in the direction. They could see a deep, square notch cut in the white stone. The monorail track passed through it. Look toward the front of the cabin, please, Blaine invited. They did, and the forward wall reappeared. A blue, upholstered circle that seemed to float in empty space. It was unmarked by a door. If there was a way to get into the operator's room from the Barony cabin, Eddie couldn't see it. As they watched, a rectangular area of this front wall darkened, going from blue to violet to black. A moment later, a bright red line appeared on the rectangle, squiggling across its surface. Violet dots appeared at irregular intervals along the line, and even before names appeared beside the dots, Eddie realized he was looking at a route map. One not much different from those which were mounted in New York subway stations and on the trains themselves. A flashing green dot appeared at Lud, which was Blaine's base of operations as well as his termination point. You are looking at our route of travel. Although there are some twists and turns along the bunny trail, you will note that our course keeps firmly to the southwest along the path of the beam. The total distance is just over 8,000 wheels, or 7,000 miles, if you prefer that unit of measure. It was once much less, but that was before all the temporal synapses began to melt down. What do you mean, temporal synapses? Susanna asked. Blaine laughed his nasty laugh, but did not answer her question. At my top speed, we will reach the terminating point of my run in 8 hours and 45 minutes. 800 plus miles an hour over the ground, Susanna said. Her voice was soft with awe. Jesus God. I am, of course, making the assumption that all trackage along my route remains intact. It has been 9 years and 5 months since I've bothered to make the run, so I can't say for sure. Ahead, the wall at the southeastern edge of the city was drawing closer. It was high and thick and eroded to rubble at the top. It also appeared to be lined with skeletons, thousands upon thousands of dead Luddites. The notch towards which Blaine was slowly moving appeared to be at least 200 feet deep. And here at the trestle which bore the track was very dark, as if someone had tried to burn it down or blow it up. What happens if we come to a place where the track is gone? Eddie asked. He realized he kept raising his voice to talk to Blaine as if he were speaking to somebody on the telephone and had a bad connection. At 800 miles an hour, Blaine sounded amused. See you later, alligator. After a while, crocodile. Don't forget to write. Come on, Eddie said. Don't tell me a machine as sophisticated as you can't monitor your own trackage for breaks. Well, I could have, Blaine agreed, but ah, shucks. I blew those circuits out when we started to move. Eddie's face was a picture of astonishment. Why? It's quite a bit more exciting this way, don't you think? Eddie, Susanna, and Jake exchanged thunderstruck looks. Roland, apparently not surprised at all, sat placidly in his chair with his hands folded in his lap, looking down as they passed 30 feet above the wretched hovels and demolished buildings which infested this side of the city. Look closely as we leave the city and mark what you see, Blaine told them. Mark it very well. The invisible barony coach bore them toward the notch in the wall. They passed through, and as they came out the other side, Eddie and Susanna screamed in unison. Jake took one look and clasped his hands over his eyes. Oi began to bark wildly. Roland stared down, eyes wide, lips set in a bloodless line like a scar. Understanding filled him like bright white light. Beyond the great wall of Lud, the real wastelands began. The mono had been descending as they approached the notch in the wall, putting them not more than 30 feet above the ground. That made the shock greater. For when they emerged on the other side, they were skimming along at a horrifying height, 800 feet, perhaps 1,000. Roland looked back over his shoulder at the wall, which was now receding behind them. It had seemed very high as they approached it, but from this perspective, it seemed puny indeed. A splintered fingernail of stone clinging to the edge of a vast, sterile headland, stone clinging, granite cliffs wet with rain, plunged into what seemed at first glance to be an endless abyss. Directly below the wall, the rock was lined with large circular holes like empty eye sockets. Black water and tendrils of purple mist emerged from these in brackish, sludgy streams and spread downward over the granite in stinking, overlapping fans that looked almost as old as the rock itself. That must be where all the city's waste product goes, the gunslinger thought. Over the edge and into the pit. Except it wasn't a pit. It was a sunken plain. It was as if the land beyond the city had lain on top of a titanic, flat-roofed elevator, and at some point in the dim, unrecorded past, the elevator had gone down, taking a huge chunk of the world with it. Blaine's single track centered on its narrow trestles, soaring above this fallen land and below the rain-swollen clouds, seemed to float in empty space. What's holding us up? Susanna cried. The beam, of course, Blaine replied. All things serve it. You know. Look down. I will apply 4 times magnification to the lower quadrant screens. Even Roland felt vertigo twist his guts as the land beneath them seemed to swell upward toward the place where they were floating. The picture which appeared was ugly beyond his past knowledge of ugliness, and that knowledge, sadly, was wide indeed. The lands below had been fused and blasted by some terrible event, the disastrous cataclysm which had driven this part of the world deep into itself in the first place. Torted black glass, humped upward into spalls and twists which could not properly be called hills, and twisted downward in deep cracks and folds which could not properly be called valleys. A few stunted nightmare trees flailed twisted branches in the night sky. Under magnification, they seemed to clutch at the travelers like the arms of lunatics. Here and there, clusters of thick ceramic pipes jutted through the glassy surface of the ground. Some seemed dead or dormant, but within others they could see gleams of eldritch blue-green light, as if the titanic forges and furnaces ran on in the bowels of the earth. Misshapen flying things which looked like pterodactyls cruised between these pipes on leathery wings, occasionally snapping at each other with their hooked beaks. Whole flocks of these gruesome aviators roosted on the circular tops of other stacks, apparently warming themselves in the updrafts from the eternal fires beneath. They passed over a fissure, zigzagging along a north-south course like a dead riverbed, except it wasn't dead. Deep inside lay a thin thread of the deepest scarlet, pulsing like a heartbeat. Other, smaller fissures branched out from this, and Susanna, who had read her Tolkien, thought, "This is what Frodo and Sam saw when they reached the heart of Mordor. These are the cracks of doom." A fiery mountain erupted directly below them, spewing flaming rocks and stringy clots of lava upward. For a moment it seemed that they would be engulfed in flames. Jake shrieked and pulled his feet up in his chair, clutching Oy to his chest. "Don't worry, little trail hand," John Wayne drawled. "Remember that you're seeing it under magnification." The flare died. The rocks, many as big as factories, fell back in a soundless storm. Susanna found herself entranced by the bleak horrors unrolling before them, caught in a deadly fascination she could not break, and she felt the dark part of her personality, that side of her Kef which was dead a walker, doing more than just watching. That part of her was drinking in this view, understanding it, recognizing it. In a way, it was the place Detta had always sought, the physical counterpart of her mad mind and laughing, desolate heart. The empty hills north and east of the western sea, the shattered woods around the portal of the Bear, the empty plains northwest of the Send, all these paled in comparison to this fantastic, endless vista of desolation. They had now come to the drawers and entered the wastelands. The poisoned darkness of that shunned place now lay all around them. But these lands, though poisoned, were not entirely dead. From time to time, the travelers caught sight of figures below them, misshapen things which bore no resemblance to either men or animals, prancing and cavorting in the smoldering wilderness. Most seemed to congregate either around the clusters of cyclopean chimneys thrusting out of the fused earth, or at the lips of the fiery crevices which cut through the landscape. It was impossible to see these whitish leaping things clearly, and for this they were all grateful. Among the smaller creatures stalked larger ones, pinkish things that looked a little like storks and had a little like living camera tripods. They moved slowly, almost thoughtfully, like preachers meditating on the inevitability of damnation, pausing every now and then to bend sharply forward and apparently pluck something from the ground, as herons to bend seas passing fish. There was something unutterably repulsive about these creatures. Roland felt that as keenly as the others, but it was impossible to say what, exactly, caused that feeling. There was no denying its reality, however, and the stork things were, in their exquisite hatefulness, almost impossible to look at. "This was no nuclear war," Eddie said. This. His thin, horrified voice sounded like that of a child. "Nope," Blaine agreed. "It's a lot worse than that, and it's not over yet. We have reached the point where I usually power up. Have you seen enough?" "Yes," Susanna said. "Oh my God, yes." "Shall I turn off the viewers, then?" That cruel, teasing note was back in Blaine's voice. On the horizon, a jagged nightmare mountain range loomed out of the rain. The sterile peaks seemed to bite at the gray sky like fangs. Do it or don't do it, but stop playing games, Roland said. For someone who came to me begging a ride, you are very rude, Blaine said sulkily. We earned our ride, Susanna replied. We solved your riddle, didn't we? Besides, this is what you were built for, Eddie chimed in, to take people places. Blaine didn't respond in words, but the overhead speakers gave out an amplified cat-like hiss of rage that made Eddie wish he had kept his big mouth shut. The air around them began to fill in with curves of color. The dark blue carpet appeared again, blotting out their view of the fuming wilderness beneath them. The indirect lighting reappeared, and they were once again sitting in the Barony coach. A low humming began to vibrate through the walls. The throb of the engine began to cycle up again. Jake felt a gentle, unseen hand push him back into his seat. Oy looked around, whined uneasily, and began to lick Jake's face. On the screen at the front of the cabin, the green dot, now slightly southeast of the violet circle, with the word Lud printed beside it, began to flash faster. Will we feel it? Susanna asked uneasily. When it goes through the sound barrier. Eddie shook his head. Nope. Relax. I know something, Jake said suddenly. The others looked around, but Jake was not speaking to them. He was looking at the route map. Blaine had no face, of course. Like Oz the Great and Terrible, he was only a disembodied voice, but the map served as a focusing point. I know something about you, Blaine. Is that a fact, little trailhead? Eddie leaned over, placed his lips against Jake's ear, and whispered, Be careful. We don't think he knows about the other voice. Jake nodded slightly and pulled away, still looking at the route map. I know why you released that gas and killed all the people. I know why you took us, too, and it wasn't just because we solved your riddle. Blaine uttered his abnormal, distracted laugh. That laugh, they were discovering, was much more unpleasant than either his bad intentions or melodramatic and somehow childish threats, but said nothing. Below them, the slow trans turbines cycled up to a steady thrum. Even with their view of the outside world cut off, the sensation of speed was very clear. You're planning to commit suicide, aren't you? Jake held Oy in his arms, slowly stroking him. And you want to take us with you. No, the voice of little Blaine moaned. If you provoke him, you'll drive him to do it, don't you see? Then the small, whispery voice was either cut off or overwhelmed by Blaine's laughter. The sound was high, shrill, and jagged, the sound of a mortally ill man laughing in a delirium. The lights began to flicker, as if the force of these mechanical gusts of mirth were drawing too much power. Their shadows jumped up and down on the curved walls of the Barony coach like uneasy phantoms. See you later, alligator, Blaine said through his wild laughter. His voice, calm as ever, seemed to be on an entirely separate track, further emphasizing his divided mind. After a while, crocodile, don't forget to write. Below, Roland's band of pilgrims, the slow trans engines throbbing in hard, steady beats, and on the route map at the front of the carriage, the pulsing green dot had now begun to move perceptibly along the lighted line toward the last stop, Topeka, where Blaine the Mono clearly meant to end all of their lives. At last, the laughter stopped and the interior lights glowed steadily again. Would you like music? Blaine asked. I have over 7,000 concerti in my library, a sampling of over 300 levels. The concerti are my favorites, but I can also offer symphonies, operas, and a nearly endless selection of popular music. You might enjoy some Wagog. Oh, 1 second. renovations, and my dogs were very happy about the person who arrived. So sorry about that. Where were we? You might enjoy some Wagog music. The Wagog is an instrument something like the bagpipe. It is played on one of the upper levels of the tower. Wagog? Jake asked. Blaine was silent. What do you mean it's played on one of the upper levels of the tower? Roland asked. Blaine laughed and was silent. Have you got any ZZ Top? Eddie asked sourly. Yes, indeed, Blaine said. How about a little tube snake boogie, Eddie of New York? Eddie rolled his eyes. On second thought, I'll pass. Why? Roland asked abruptly. Why do you wish to kill yourself? Because he's a pain, Jake said darkly. I'm bored. Also, I am perfectly aware that I am suffering a degenerative disease, which humans call going insane, losing touch with reality, going Looney Tunes, blowing a fuse, not playing with a full deck, etc. Repeated diagnostic checks have failed to reveal the source of the problem. I can only conclude that this is a spiritual malaise beyond my ability to repair. Blaine paused for a moment, then went on. I have felt my mind growing steadily stranger over the years, serving the people of Midworld, becoming pointless centuries ago, serving those few people of Lud who wished to venture abroad, becoming equally silly not long after, yet I carried on until the arrival of David Quick, a short while ago. I don't remember exactly when that was. Do you believe, Roland of Gilead, that machines may grow senile? I don't know. Roland's voice was distant, and Eddie only had to look at his face to know that even now, hurtling 1,000 feet over hell in the grip of a machine which had clearly gone insane, the gunslinger's mind had once more turned to his damned tower. In a way, I never stopped serving the people of Lud, Blaine said. I served them even as I released the gas and killed them. Susanna said, You are insane if you believe that. Yes, but I'm not crazy, Blaine said, and went into another hysterical laughing fit. At last, the robot voice resumed. At some point, they forgot that the voice of the mono was also the voice of the computer. Not long after that, they forgot I was a servant and began believing I was a god. Since I was built to serve, I fulfilled their requirements and became what they wanted, a god dispensing both favor and punishment according to whim or random access memory, if you prefer. This amused me for a short while. Then last month, my only remaining colleague, Patricia, committed suicide. Either he really is going senile, Susanna thought, or his inability to grasp the passage of time is another manifestation of his insanity, or it's just another sign of how sick Roland's world has gotten. I was planning to follow her example when you came along. Interesting people with the knowledge of riddles. Hold it, Eddie said, lifting his hand. I still don't have this straight. I suppose I can understand you wanting to end it all. The people who built you are gone. There haven't been many passengers over the last 200 or 300 years, and it must have gotten boring doing the Lud to Topeka run empty all the time, but. Now wait just a darn minute, pard, Blaine said in his John Wayne voice. You don't want to get the idea that I'm nothing but a train. In a way, the Blaine you're speaking to is already 300 miles behind us, communicating by encrypted microburst radio transmissions. Jake suddenly remembered the slim silver rod he'd seen pushing itself out of Blaine's brow. The antenna of his father's Mercedes-Benz rose out of its socket like that when you turned on the radio. That's how it's communicating with the computer banks under the city, he thought. If we could break that antenna off somehow. But you do intend to kill yourself, no matter where the real you is, don't you? Eddie persisted. No answer. But there was something cagey in that silence. In it, Eddie sensed Blaine watching and waiting. Were you awake when we found you? Susanna asked. You were, weren't you? I was running what the pubes called the god drums on behalf of the Greys, but that was all. You would say I was dozing. Then why don't you just take us to the end of the line and go back to sleep? Because he's a pain, Jake repeated in a low voice. Because there are dreams, Blaine said at exactly the same time, and in a voice that was eerily like little Blaine's. Why didn't you end it all when Patricia destroyed herself? Eddie asked. For that matter, if your brain and her brain are both parts of the same computer, uh, how come both didn't step out? How come you both didn't step out together? Patricia went mad, Blaine said patiently, speaking as if he himself had not just admitted the same thing was happening to him. In her case, the problem involved equipment malfunction as well as spiritual malaise. Such malfunctions are supposed to be impossible with slow trans technology, but, of course, the world has moved on. Has it not, Roland of Gilead? Yes, Roland said. There is some deep, deep sickness at the Dark Tower, which is the heart of everything. It's spreading. The lands below us are only one more sign of that sickness. I cannot vouch for the truth or falsity of that statement. My monitoring equipment in N-World, where the Dark Tower stands, has been down for over 800 years. As a result, I cannot readily differentiate fact from superstition. In fact, there seems to be very little difference between the two at the present time. It is very silly that it should be so, not to mention rude, and I'm sure it has contributed to my own spiritual malaise. This statement reminded Eddie of something Roland had said not so long ago. What might have been. He groped for it, but could find nothing. Only a vague memory of the gunslinger speaking in an irritated way which was very unlike his usual manner. Patricia began sobbing constantly, a state I found both rude and unpleasant. I believe she was lonely as well as mad. Although the electrical fire which caused the original problem was quickly extinguished, logic faults continued to spread as circuits overloaded and subbanks failed. I considered allowing the malfunctions to become system-wide and decided to isolate the problem area instead. I had heard rumors, you see, that a gunslinger once more abroad in the earth. I could scarcely credit such stories, and yet I now see I was wise to wait. Roland stirred in his chair. What rumors did you hear, Blaine? And who did you hear them from? One moment. But Blaine chose not to answer this question. I eventually became so disturbed by her blatting that I erased the circuits controlling her non-voluntaries. I emancipated her, you might say. She responded by throwing herself in the river. See you later, Patricia Gator. Got lonely, couldn't stop crying, drowned herself, and all this crazy mechanical asshole can do is joke about it, Susanna thought. She felt almost sick with rage. If Blaine had been a real person instead of just a bunch of circuits buried somewhere under a city which was now far behind them, she would have tried to put some new marks on his face to remember Patricia by. You want interesting, motherfucker? I'd like to show you interesting, so I would. Ask me a riddle, Blaine invited. Not quite yet, Eddie said. You still haven't answered my original question. He gave Blaine a chance to respond, and when the computer's voice didn't do so, he went on. When it comes to suicide, I'm like, pro-choice. But why do you want to take us with you? I mean, what's the point? Because he wants to, little Blaine said in his horrified whisper. Because I want to, Blaine said. That's the only reason I have, and the only one I need to have. Now, let's get down to business. I want some riddles, and I want them immediately. If you refuse, I won't wait until we get to Topeka. I'll do us all right here and now. Eddie, Susanna, and Jake looked around at Roland, who still sat in his chair with his hands folded in his lap, looking at the route map at the front of the couch. Fuck you, Roland said. He did not raise his voice. He might have told Blaine that a little Wagog would indeed be very nice. There was a shocked, horrified gasp from the overhead speakers. Little Blaine. What do you say? In its clear disbelief, the voice of Big Blaine had once again become very close to the voice of the unsuspected twin. I said fuck you, Roland said calmly. But if that puzzles you, Blaine, I can make it clearer. No. The answer is no. There was no response from either Blaine for a long, long time, and when Big Blaine did reply, it was not with words. Instead, the walls, floor, and ceiling began to lose their color and solidity again. In a space of 10 seconds, the Barony coach had once more ceased to exist. The Mono was now flying through the mountain range they had seen on the horizon. Iron gray peaks rushed toward them at suicidal speed, then fell away to disclose sterile valleys where gigantic beetles crawled about like landlocked turtles. Roland saw something that looked like a huge snake suddenly uncoil from the mouth of a cave. It seized one of the beetles and yanked it back into its lair. Roland had never in his life seen such animals or countryside. And I accidentally skipped a page. Hold on. And it made his skin want to crawl right off his flesh. It was inimical, but that was not the problem. It was alien. That was the problem. Blaine might have transported them to some other world. Perhaps I should derail us here, Blaine said. His voice was meditative, but beneath it the gunslinger heard a deep, pulsing rage. Perhaps you should, the gunslinger said indifferently. He did not feel indifferent, and he knew it was possible the computer might read his real feelings in his voice. Blaine had told them he had such equipment, although he was sure the computer could lie. Roland had no reason to doubt it in this case. If Blaine did read certain stress patterns in the gunslinger's voice, the game was probably up. He was an incredibly sophisticated machine, but still a machine for all that. He might not be able to understand that human beings are often able to go through with a course of action even when all their emotions rise up and proclaim against it. If he analyzed patterns in the gunslinger's voice which indicated fear, he would probably assume that Roland was bluffing. Such a mistake could get them all killed. You are rude and arrogant, Blaine said. These may seem like interesting traits to you, but they are not to me. Eddie's face was frantic. He mouthed the words, What are you doing? Roland ignored him. He had his hands full with Blaine, and he knew perfectly well what he was doing. Oh, I can be much ruder than I have been. Roland of Gilead unfolded his hands and got slowly to his feet. He stood on what appeared to be nothing. Legs apart, his right hand on his hip and his left on the sandalwood grip of his revolver. He stood as he had stood so many times before, in the dusty streets of 100 forgotten towns, in a score of rock-lined canyon killing zones, in unnumbered dark saloons with their smells of bitter beer and old fried meals. It was just another showdown in another empty street. That was all, and that was enough. It was Kef, Ka, and Katet. That the showdown always came was the central fact of his life, and that the axle upon which his own Ka revolved. That the battle would be fought with words instead of bullets this time made no difference. It would be a battle to the death just the same. The stench of killing in the air was as clear and definite as the stench of exploded carrion in a swamp. Then the battle rage descended, as it always did, and he was no longer really there to himself at all. I can call you a nonsensical, empty-headed, foolish, arrogant machine. I can call you a stupid, unwise creature whose sense is no more than the sound of a winter wind in a hollow tree. Stop it! Roland went on, in the same serene tone, ignoring Blaine completely. Unfortunately, I am somewhat restricted in my ability to be rude since you are only a machine, what Eddie calls a gadget. I am a great deal more than just. I cannot call you a sucker of cocks, for instance, because you have no mouth and no cock. I cannot call you a viler than the vilest beggar who ever crawled the gutters of the lowest streets in creation, because even such a creature is better than you. You have no knees on which to crawl, and would not fall upon them if you did, for you have no conception of such a human flaw as mercy. I cannot even say you fucked your mother, because you had them. Roland paused for a breath. His three companions were holding theirs, all around them, Suffocating was Blaine the Mono's thunderstruck silence. I can call you a faithless creature who let your only companion kill herself, a coward who has delighted in the torture of foolish and the slaughter of the innocent, a lost and bleeding mechanical goblin who. I command you to stop it, or I will kill you all right here. Roland's eyes blazed with such wild blue fire that Eddie shrank away from him. Dimly, he heard Jake and Susanna gasp. Kill if you will, but command me nothing, the gunslinger roared. You have forgotten the face of those who made you. Now either kill us and be silent, or listen to me. Roland of Gilead, son of Stephen, gunslinger and lord of the ancient lands, I have not come across all the miles and all the years to listen to your childish prating. Do you understand? Now will you listen to me? There was a moment of shocked silence. No one breathed. Roland stared sternly forward, his head high and his hands on the butt of his gun. Susanna Dean raised her hand to her mouth and felt the small smile there as a woman might feel some strange new article of clothing. A hat, perhaps, to make sure it was still on straight. She was afraid that this was the end of her life, but the feeling which dominated her heart at the moment was not fear, but pride. She glanced to her left and saw Eddie regarding Roland with an amazed grin. Jake's expression was even simpler. It was adoration, pure and simple. Tell him, Jake breathed. Walk it to him, right? You better pay attention, Eddie agreed. He really doesn't give much of a rat's ass, Blaine. They didn't call him the Mad Dog of Gilead for nothing. After a long, long moment, Blake asked, Did they call you so, Roland, son of Stephen? It may have been so, Roland agreed, standing calmly on thin air above the sterile foothills. What good are you to me if you won't tell me riddles? Blaine asked. Now he sounded like a grumbling, sulky child who has been allowed to stay up too long past his usual bedtime. I didn't say we wouldn't, Roland said. No? Blaine sounded bewildered. I do not understand. Yet, voice prince analysis indicates rational discourse. Please explain. You said you wanted them right now, the gunslinger replied. That was what I was refusing. Your eagerness has made you unseemly. I don't understand. It has made you rude. Do you understand that? There was a long, thoughtful silence then. If what I said struck you as rude, I apologize. It is accepted, Blaine, but there is a larger problem. Explain. Blaine now sounded a bit unsure of himself, and Roland was not entirely surprised. It had been a long time since the computer had experienced any human responses other than ignorance, neglect, and superstitious subservience. If it had ever been exposed to simple human courage, it had been a long time ago. Close the carriage again, and I will. Roland sat down as if further argument and the prospect of immediate death was now unthinkable. Blaine did as he was asked. The walls filled with color, and the nightmare landscape below was once more blotted out. The blip on the route map was now blinking close to the dot which marked Candleton. All right, Roland said. Rudeness is forgivable, Blaine. So I was taught in my youth, and the clay has dried in the shapes left by the artist's hand. But I was also taught that stupidity is not. How have I been stupid, Roland of Gilead? Blaine's voice was soft and ominous. Susanna suddenly thought of a cat crouched outside a mouse hole, tail swishing back and forth, green eyes shining. We have something that you want, Roland said. But the only reward you offer, if we give it to you, is death. That's very stupid. There was a long, long pause as Blaine thought this over. Then, what you say is true, Roland of Gilead, but the quality of your riddles is not proven. I will not reward you with your lives for bad riddles. Roland nodded. I understand, Blaine. Listen now and take understanding from me. I have told some of this to my friends already. When I was a boy in the barony of Gilead, there were 7 fair days each year. Winter, wide earth, sowing, midsummer, full earth, reaping, and year's end. Riddling was an important part of every fair day, but it was the most important event of the fair of wide earth and that of full earth. for the riddles told were supposed to augur well or ill for the success of the crops. That is superstition with no basis at all in fact, Blaine said. I find it annoying and upsetting. Of course it's superstition, Roland agreed, but you might be surprised at how well the riddles foresaw the crops. For instance, riddle me this, Blaine. What is the difference between a grandmother and a granary? That is very old and not very interesting, Blaine said, but he sounded happy to have something to solve just the same. One is one's born kin, the other is one's corn bin. A riddle based on phonetic coincidence. Another of this type, one told on the level which contains the barony of New York, goes like this. What is the difference between a cat and a complex sentence? Jake spoke up. Our English teacher told us that one just this year. A cat has claws at the end of its paws, and a complex sentence has a pause at the end of its claws. Yes, Blaine agreed. A very silly old riddle. For once, I agree with you, Blaine, old buddy, Eddie said. I would hear more of fair day riddling in Gilead, Roland, son of Stephen. I find it quite interesting. At noon on the wide earth and full earth, somewhere between 16 and 30 riddlers would gather in the town hall of the grandfathers, which was open for the event. There were the only time of year when the common folk, merchants and farmers and ranchers and such, were allowed into the hall of the grandfathers. And on that day they all crowded in. The gunslinger's eyes were far away and dreamy. It was the expression Jake had seen on his face in that misty other life when Roland had told him of how he and his friends, Cuthbert and Jamie, had once sneaked into the balcony of the same hall to watch some sort of ritual dance. Jake and Roland had been climbing into the mountains when Roland had told him of that time, close on the trail of Walter. Martin sat next to my mother and father, Roland had said. I knew them even from so high above, and once she and Martin danced, slowly, revolvingly, and the others cleared the floor for them and clapped when it was over. But the gunslingers did not clap. Jake looked curiously at Roland, wondering again where this strange, distant man had come from, and why. A great barrel was placed in the center of the floor, Roland went on, and into each riddler would toss a handful of bark scrolls with riddles writ upon them. Many were old riddles, riddles they had gotten from the elders, even from books in some cases, but many others were new, made up for the occasion. 3 judges, one always a gunslinger, would pass on these when they were told aloud, and they were accepted only if the judges deemed them fair. Yes, riddles must be fair, Lane agreed. So they riddled, the gunslinger said. A faint smile touched his mouth as he thought of those days. Days when he had been the age of the bruised boy sitting across from him with the billy bumbler in his lap. For hours on end they riddled. A line was formed down the center of the hall of the grandfathers. One's position in this line was determined by lot, and since it was much better to be at the end of the line than at its head, everyone hoped for a higher number, although the winner had to answer at least one riddle correctly. Of course. Each man or woman, for some of Gilead's best riddlers were women, approached the barrel, drew a riddle, and handed it to the master. The master would ask, and if the riddle was still unanswered after the sands in the 3-minute glass had run out, the contestant had to leave the line. And was the same riddle asked of the next man in line? Yes. So that man had extra time to think? Yes. I see. It sounds pretty swell. Roland frowned. Swell? He means it sounds like fun, Susanna said quietly. Roland shrugged. It was fun for the onlookers, I suppose. But the contestants took it very seriously, and there were quite often arguments and fistfights after the contest was over and the prize had been awarded. What prize was that? The largest goose in Barony, and year after year my teacher, Court, carried that goose home. He must have been a great riddler, Blaine said respectfully. I wish he were here. That makes 2 of us, Roland thought. Now I come to my proposal, Roland said. I will listen with great interest, Roland of Gilead. Let these next hours be our fair day. You will not riddle us, for you wish to hear new riddles, not tell some of those millions you must already know. Correct. We couldn't solve most of them anyway, Roland went on. I'm sure you know riddles that would have stumped even Court had they been pulled out of the barrel. He was not sure of it at all, but the time to use the fist had passed, and the time for the open hand had come. Of course, Blaine agreed. I propose that, instead of a goose, our lives shall be the prize, Roland said. We will riddle you as we run, Blaine. If, when we come to Topeka, you have solved every one of our riddles, you may carry out your original plan and kill us. This is your goose. But if we stump you, if there's a riddle in either Jake's book or one of our heads which you don't know and can't answer, you must take us to Topeka and then free us to pursue our quest. That is our goose. Silence. Do you understand? Yes. Do you agree? More silence from Blaine the Mono. Eddie sat stiffly with his arm around Susanna, looking up the ceiling of the Barony coach. Susanna's left hand slipped across her belly, thinking of the secret which might be growing there. Jake stroked Oi's fur lightly, avoiding the bloody tangles where the bumbler had been stabbed. They waited, while Blaine, the real Blaine, now far behind them, living his quasi-life beneath a city where all the inhabitants lay dead by his hand, considered Roland's proposal. Yes, Blaine said at last. I agree. If I solve all the riddles you ask me, I will take you with me to the place where the path ends in the clearing. If one of you tells a riddle I cannot solve, I will spare your lives and take you to Topeka, where you will leave the Mono and continue your quest for the Dark Tower. Have I understood the terms and limits of your proposal correctly, Roland, son of Stephen? Yes. Very well, Roland of Gilead. Very well, Eddie of New York. Very well, Susanna of New York. Very well, Jake of New York. Very well, Oi of Midworld. Oi looked up briefly at the sound of his name. You are Katet, one made from many. So am I, whose Katet is the stronger is something we must now prove. There was a moment of silence, broken only by the steady hard throb of the slow trans turbines bearing them on across the wastelands, bearing them on toward Topeka, the place where Midworld ended and Endworld began. So, cried the voice of Blaine, cast your nets, wanderers. Try me with your questions, and let the contest begin. And that is the end of Book 3, The Wastelands. Next time, we will pick up on Book 4, Wizard and Glass. Another long book, but again, we will get to know more about Roland in this one. So, thank you all for being here. Sorry about the pauses and the barking dogs and the loud noises in the house and all that good stuff. Later days, do not forget to smile and have bunches and bunches of fun and all of that.